You're with Kate O'Toole on ABC Radio Brisbane.
Good morning to you, 14 past 7. How's this for a number? 187%. That is how much reported breaches of DV protection orders have gone up over the last 10 years. 187%. That's just one of the alarming statistics in the 2019-20 crime report that was released yesterday by the Queensland Government Statisticians Office. Other figures include that the number of unique offenders, the individuals actually committing crime, is at its lowest level in a decade. So it's less alarming. Another one, the proportion of offenders aged under 25 is also at its lowest in a decade, but still more than 1 in 5 offenders are aged between 10 and 19 years old. So what do we make of these figures? What's really happening? And will the new youth justice reforms passed by Parliament just this week put a dent in any of those numbers? When it comes to DV, what can be done to improve those stats? Dr. Terry Goldsworthy is an Associate Professor in Criminology at Bond University and a former Detective Inspector from Queensland Police with 28 years of policing experience. Terry Goldsworthy, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Kate.
Let's take a look at the issue of domestic violence first. And as we know, the headlines in this area keep coming and they keep shocking us. What do we need to know about the stats contained in this report around domestic violence?
Yeah, look, I guess there's a few things we need to observe, and it's the broader context which will probably help us to start with, and that is that the Australian Institute of Criminology runs a homicide monitoring program for Australia. And in particular, it looks at domestic and family homicides, and intimate partner is one of those categories. It's worth noting that the intimate partner homicide rate for women was the second lowest recorded since 1990 in 2019. So I just flagged that only that I guess we're caught in the media cycle of these terrible events that occur, and sometimes the perceptions that we get from media don't match the reality of the broader statistical data that we have. So I think we're making some strides in terms of reducing these types of crimes. In regards to the breaches, I think there's a couple of things to note there. That interesting feature you gave over the 10-year period and that massive increase, there's a couple of explanations for that. One would be that we have broadened the definition of domestic violence during that time period to include activities that we didn't when we initially brought it in 1989. The other thing that's probably changed, and I commented on this in 2015 when we had that terrible series of domestic homicides, that there needed to be a change in police culture from where domestic violence was seen as a distraction in terms of policing, core policing, and didn't become really a core policing issue until the peak domestic violence issue happened, which, and I'm talking about there about a domestic homicide in which, all the police resources were put into it. So I think we've seen a change in culture there in terms of police being much more engaged in acting on domestic violence issues earlier than they perhaps were in the past.
Is there still some way to go in that? Because Golchevsky was acknowledging that if somebody has engaged with the system and they still have been a victim of a homicide, that is to some extent, and they're going to launch an investigation to figure out to what extent, to some extent, that's a failure of the system to protect that person when they've engaged with the system in order to do that. Do you agree with that idea?
Yeah, I do. And, I don't necessarily see it as... the police will do their review, the courts, and no doubt the coroners, the family violence unit and the coroner's court will look at it too, this particular incident in time. In essence, I guess, if that outcome happens, it is a sense of failure. But, I think we need to kind of be cognizant of a couple of issues here. And one is, if you look at the broad kind of reasons why crime occur, we have a motivated offender, we have a suitable victim, and where there's a lack of guardianship, that crime will occur. And I think, the really important part in these type of offences is a motivated offender. And, I often used to think when I was in the police that there are some homicides that you just could not stop. And by that I mean that the offender is that motivated and they make a value judgment that deterrence is not going to stop them, the fact that they'll go to jail for life. is something that they've looked at and they've gone, I don't care. And when someone takes that viewpoint, it is very difficult to protect someone against them unless you incarcerate that person.
And even now, even with all the technology we've got, I mean, we talked about, ankle monitoring for juvenile offenders, and people have suggested that sort of thing for people who've breached DV orders, for example. Is that not a suitable way of protecting someone proactively, I mean?
Yeah, look, they are. They're all good. Actions to take. But, what I'm saying is you can put them in place. You can put an ankle bracelet on someone, and if the partner is that motivated to commit the act, they'll simply remove the bracelet, drive to the location and commit the offence before the police can respond. I mean, that's what I'm saying. If someone really wants to do it, it is very, very difficult to stop it. I mean, these people that would do that type of thing are the tiny minority. But what you see in these kind of events we've seen this week, etc., is probably examples of those minorities. I mean, they're very difficult to guard against.
This is what Police Deputy Commissioner Steve Golchevsky had to say on this issue.
What we know is only 1 in 6 perpetrators of DV actually breach. So the vast majority, or the majority, do not breach. Of those that do breach, a significant proportion of those breaches are quite technical in nature or do not involve violence. And we also know that of those breaches, there are repeat breaches. So 5,553 does not mean there were 5,553 individual perpetrators. That means that there were that many breaches, some by the same people. So when you start to do this, you get down and you see the numbers of where it really goes wrong. And this is a terrible thing to say. The breadth of DV as a problem for our community is truly appalling. The breadth of DV for our community, I'll say that again, is truly appalling. But the numbers where it has gone horrendously wrong and tragically wrong recently, in the case of both Doreen and Kelly, is a small amount. That doesn't excuse that in any way. But we need to put this in context.
So is there anything that you have been thinking about, Terry Goldsworthy, that needs to change in the way that we police this sort of immediately? Is there an obvious fix or assistance in this at this point?
Yeah, look, without commenting directly on the case before the courts.
I mean more generally because we're talking about the issue of in any instance where somebody has engaged with the system and where there's been a breach that's gone horribly wrong, as Golchevsky was talking about.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we have a domestic violence command now in the QPS, which I think is a good move, and we have a task force down here and other areas have their responses. So we now have an expertise component coming into the responses to DV through the police. And it's not just the police, there's plenty of other government agencies involved as well as non-government agencies. But I guess what we're looking at is sometimes you see this common thread in these events over the past couple of years where people have gone to the police for assistance and it appears not much has been done. So, if someone's exhibiting risk factors, I mean, we now have identified risk factors. I think, those type of issues need to come into the fore in terms of what the police response should be. I mean, if we're going to put in place that there's a presumption against bail, as we have, for DV matters, serious DV offences and breaches of DV orders, then we need to make sure that that's being enforced through the courts. And it's not just, in little statutes, but not actually the intent is not being carried through to the courts. And some of the risk factors that we can easily identify as a history of DV, pending or actual separation, the use of alcohol or drugs, previous use of violence. There's a whole range of things there, threats to commit suicide by the perpetrator. I mean, all those things are really good indicators as to what the response should be and how, I guess, urgent that response should be.
Are you concerned that that's not happening now?
Well, I guess this will be borne out, and it's borne out sometimes with the coroner's reviews that perhaps the responses could have been better. So I'll wait for the police inquiry and see what they come out with at the end of it. But yeah, I think where we're seeing commentary in the media that people are going to the police on multiple occasions seeking help, and there doesn't appear to be any great response in regards to that. That does cause me concern.
Well, I mean, just to look at a previous case, Fabiana Palheras, for example, killed by her ex-boyfriend on the Gold Coast in 2015. With the coroner who examined that case, the coroner found that there had already been significant changes in this space, and the sorts of recommendations that would have been made had already been changed in the system. So how effective those changes have been and whether they're have been completely adopted throughout the system, I suppose we'll see in future. Is that your thinking?
Yeah, look, I mean, you can put these changes in. I guess it comes back to my comment before about a motivated offender. Short of locking them up on a risk prevention basis, they have that capability to still offend. They can, get around the system if they're that motivated. Just
looking now at the youth justice reforms that were passed by the state's parliament this week and sort of holding them up next to the stats that we see in this report that's just been released yesterday, what's the picture that we can put about youth crime in Queensland?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's less unique offenders, as you pointed out in your intro, so that's different people committing crime. But what we have seen is an increase in the amount of offending. So we've got, I guess you could say, the same people committing more offences. The big increases that we've seen in those type of offences that they're doing are things like drug offences, which is concerning, unlawful use offences, break and enter and robbery. And, we're continuing to see young people overrepresented in terms of offences such as robbery. They make up 50% of offenders. But in terms of overall offending, they only count for 16%. And for unlawful use of motor vehicles, they make up 40% of offenders. So there's some key crime categories that they're still well and truly overrepresented and that they're cause for concern.
And do the changes that have been passed this week, in your view, form an effective way to change those stats?
Look, I think they're all good moves. The GPS monitoring, depending on how effective it is and how responsive the police are to that, is a good thing. The support for families, etc., is good because we know that broken families and problems in the home are key drivers of youth offending. I guess the glaring thing that stands out for me that I would have liked to have seen in there would have been a breach of bail offence for young people. And I say that just on the scenario that we're now faced with, where the police may catch young Jimmy, who's got an ankle bracelet on, GPS tracked, outside of his house, outside of his curfew hours, and there's no offence for the police to action it. I mean, they can simply go down and say, "Oh, can we drive you home, Jimmy, so you can comply with your bail?" So I just don't understand why there's a resistance for that kind of offence that could be used to really impact on some of these hardcore offenders.
The Human Rights Law Centre says that these new laws are dangerous and that they'll only serve to trap Queensland children in the criminal legal system. What do you make of that comment?
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that necessarily. I mean, these are the kids are in the system. What we've seen is many of the laws are actually kind of designed to monitor them better when they're already in the system. I don't see any of these laws necessarily dragging them in more. We've strengthened anti-hooning laws, etc. We've given enhanced powers for metal wand detecting. These things are there to improve public safety. And, when you're making these decisions, there's community welfare versus individual autonomy. And community welfare must always win out. I don't think they're too draconian. I think that they're probably been well thought out, and I don't see how they're going to net widen or capture more youths and bring them into the system.
On ABC Radio Brisbane, 7:27, I'm speaking with Dr. Terry Goldsworthy. Your next ABC News headlines in just a couple of minutes. Terry, you've been trawling through this report just released yesterday. I've picked up a sort of couple of key areas, but is there anything else that's been standing out to you as you have a look through it?
Well, I guess there's two things that stand out to me, Kate. One is that it's too slow in coming out. It's quite 10 months after the end of the period. It's too late. It needs to be more timely. And the other stat that really stood out to me was over a 10-year period, our crime rate in Queensland has risen by 15.5%. That's a real concern when you consider some leading criminologists like Don Weatherburn, who used to run the New South Wales Crime Statistics Bureau, released a book this year saying that crime in Australia has declined rapidly over the last 20 years. We're going in the opposite direction, and you can see any number of indicators for that. So I think there's some real challenges there for the government and also for the senior executive of the Queensland Police in terms of how they respond to that.
So for the average person, are we right to feel that we're not living in a safer environment than we were 10, 20 years ago or not?
Well, certainly more than 10 years ago. If you compare it to 10 years ago, our crime rate is up 15%. So it would be a reasonable statement to say that if we all have fear of crime, then there is more crime there for us to be scared of.
And so what to do next? I guess we'll have to wait and see how the government responds to that notion. Dr. Terry Goldsworthy, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thanks, Kate. Dr.
Terry Goldsworthy, an associate professor in criminology at Bond University, also a former detective inspector, for Queensland Police.